Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So I wanted to share something. I was preparing my notes tonight for a class, and I'm reading from Imam Al-Baji's Sunan al-Salihin, was Sunan al-Abidin, right, his book on the ways of the righteous. And something just really kind of struck a chord with me in one of his chapter subheadings, in which he called it the Babu Adiyatu min Ghayr al-Qur'ani muntakhiba, which translates to the du'as found, selected du'as that are not found in the Quran, or selected supplications that are found elsewhere other than the Quran. And my brain is always kind of hyperactive about grammar and morphology, nahu and sarf. And so the particular usage of muntakhib. So intakhaba is a verb that means to select, right? And so the interesting thing in the Arabic language, right, and I find this is useful sometimes when you want to, you want to think about a concept. It is sometimes helpful to also engage that concept in a language other than your own, if you have the capacity to do so. And so in English, we have the phrase and the idea called natural selection. And so in the Arabic, this is referred to as intikhab al-tabi'i. Intikhab al-tabi'i. Tabi'i meaning natural, right? So natural selection. Of course, so this is a concept within a broader framework of modern day science that proposes that organisms are naturally selected, right? They're naturally selected in terms of how they change and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing about putting this word into Arabic is that it immediately brings to forefront certain assumptions that you might not automatically think of in English. And so to be succinct, right? So if you have the word or the verb ikhtasaba, or rather, if you have the word ikhtikhab, intikhab. Man, I can't talk today. This must be the fasting. Intikhab. So if you have the verb intakhaba and then the masdar or the verbal noun intikhab, this automatically brings up certain things, at least in the study of morphology and ilm al-sarf, which is one, this is the passive form, right? This particular wazn, it kind of has a passive connotation to it. So intakhaba. And so it also shows that if there is a thing that is selected, right? So if you have the thing that's being selected. So in this case, what the bab adiyatu min ghayr al-Qur'ani muntakhaba. So if you have the selections of certain dua that are not found in the Quran, meaning like perhaps from the Prophet ﷺ or whatnot. Well, the question that begs here, well, who did the selection? And by fact of it being selected, that it is muntakhaba, then that means there must be a selector to do the selecting, and that they didn't select themselves. So in the same way, in this book, right? In this book, Sunan al-Salihin, the way of the righteous, the author, al-Musannif, al-Baji, rahimahullah, right? The author of the book is the one that made the selection. So the du'at in this book that are being sourced from other than the Quran, well, they didn't source themselves. So there has to be a nakhib, right? There has to be a selector. And so this kind of jumped out at me, and for me, I don't know, because I'm sort of a nerd and a geek for these kinds of things. But nonetheless, I was like, wow. So in modern scientific philosophy, very much a sort of unchallenged and assumed truth is that organisms change throughout time as a means of natural selection. But within that, no one ever interrogates and asks, well, who did the selecting? Did the organisms select themselves? And if that's the case, then how did they select themselves the first time, or even before they existed, right? And so one of the beauties of the Arabic language, I think particularly, I mean, it's also in English as well, but I think it's a bit more recessed. And of course, it also could just be with my experience that as a native English speaker, or perhaps us who are native English speakers, we tend to be, more intuitive and reflexive in the way that we engage with the English. But when we learn the Arabic, particularly for those of us that were tulab al-ilm, then, we're learning it with such great intentionality. And then you marry that with just the fact that I think today, very few people today go through an education system in which they actually formally learn grammar. Like that just doesn't happen anymore. And so for those of, I got a little bit of grammar in school, but I think even by the time, you're in the late 70s, it just simply didn't, these things simply didn't happen. And so then when I began to learn Arabic and formally go through the nahu and the sarf and the qawa'id and the grammar and the morphology, these things to stand out, right? And so putting this idea, which is very much like a sort of Western European post-Christian idea that wants to very much banish God from any pale of consideration as it relates to either A, how life came about in general, or B, to relegate God merely to the progenitor of life, but is not involved or does not interfere in the temporal interworkings and changings of things, right? And so, like I said, just reading this, I was actually preparing my notes, and it was like, Babu adiyatu min ghayr al-Qur'ani muntakhiba. I'm like, wait a minute, intakhaba, intikhab. This is interesting. And then, like, naturally, like intikhab, in thinking about selection, intikhab at-tabi'i, natural selection. I was like, man, that doesn't make no sense. Like, how does something select itself? No, there must be a nakhib. There must be a selector that is doing the selection. And in fact, the very philosophy of it, if it's going to be true to its own rules of logic and grammar and so on, that it must submit that things don't select themselves, but rather they are selected by an outside agent, agency, or force. And so, once again, alhamdulillah, it's a great reminder to study not only the Quran, but of course, in tandem with the study of the Arabic language, which will help to open up so many broader avenues of understanding. And so when it comes to, of course, foundationally for us as Muslims, La ilaha illallah, right? That there is ذَلِكُمْ اللَّهُ رَبُّكُمْ خَالِقُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, right? La ilaha illahu. That there is no God but God. God is always present, always involved. Huwa mudabbir al-amr. He is always involved in the affairs of his creation. And the creation of God, right? The creation of Allah Ta'ala can never be discussed or thought of as somehow independent of the agency of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. And so that just a small thing that stood out to me about that. So I don't think I'll go into that tonight for the Khazira, inshallah, for talking about the dua outside of the Quran. But I just thought I would share this little tidbit of grammar and morphology and how those are great tools into understanding Islam, but also understanding and interrogating many of the philosophies that we are given through our culture that often are given to us in a way that either preempt or precede any type of justification, and they're accepted in the kind of in the public sphere, especially if they have gained some sort of agency or domination. Then they're just accepted as self-evident truths, but upon interrogation, they are actually not quite so self-evident, and in fact, they have some contradictions that are unsustainable in the face of Tawheed. So thought I would just share that. Going to get back to preparing my notes and then head to the masjid, inshallah. Hope to see some of you tonight. Jazakum Allahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum.